Tractate Bava Basra is the longest tractate in the Talmud, at least in page count. Interestingly, this is more due to the change in commentaries as opposed to the actual word count, but that's going to be discussed more at the beginning of chapter 3. For now, Bava Basra is the final of the 3 subcategory tractates detailing civil and financial law, now particularly discussing points on property law, transactions, and inheritance. Chapter 1 will begin discussion on the laws of shared property. The first Mishnah says, if 2 men are partners in ownership of a courtyard, and they decide to put a partition in the middle, the wall needs to extend into both of their portions. Generally, the construction material follows the local custom, so if people build with rough edge stones, they would use that. If they used smooth stones, that should be used, etc. Particularly if the wall is made using rough edge stones, they both must provide 3 handbreadths of land of their property to build the wall. If they're using smooth plain stones, they need to provide 2.5 handbreadths. If they're using half bricks, they need to provide 2 handbreadths each, and if they're using whole bricks, they need to provide 1.5 handbreadths each. If eventually the wall collapses, the presumption is that the wall was built jointly by the 2 of them, so the area and the stones would be divided between the 2 of them. Similarly, this would apply with a jointly owned garden. If the local custom is to build garden partitions, both can be obligated to build a partition. In a valley of grain, which there isn't really a custom to build partitions within, neither party can be forced to help build a wall. If one side decides they nevertheless want a wall, it needs to be totally on his side, and he needs to make a sign on the wall indicating that it's his. So if this wall collapses, the builder gets to keep the area and the stones as his own. If, however, both parties agree to build the wall together, it needs to be right between the fields, with a sign on both sides of the wall to indicate the joint ownership. So that way, if the wall collapses later on, they'll know that the land and the stones belong to both of them equally. The Gemara spends some time giving definition as to the word used here, mechitza, as meaning a wall, as discussed. This means as the only reason the wall must be built is as the partners agreed to build a wall initially. The implication is that it wasn't strictly necessary in the first place for such a wall to exist. They're only being obligated to build it because they had agreed to initially, which would seemingly mean that visual trespass, looking into somebody's private field, is not considered to be a damage, as the wall was only required once they both agreed to it and not beforehand. Alternatively, however, the word mechitza doesn't need to be defined as wall. It could also be translated as a division, which completely changes the situation, as now it means they agreed to make a division and are being obligated to make specifically a wall, as apparently visual trespass is considered a damage. It qualifies some of the particularities with grammar according to both of these translations. When it said that the wall must be in the center of the courtyard over both their properties, this was to show that if one person consents to the wall, he can't claim he was just consenting to have his view blocked. He's also agreeing to give up the few inches of land that the wall will stand in. Anyways, it begins to debate from a number of different cases as to whether visual trespass is considered to be a damage. It said that there needs to be a wall by a garden, but a garden is unique as the evil eye exists, so it has some unique stringencies. A later case mentions that if a wall collapses, both men are obligated to rebuild it, but again, this is different, as a pre-existing wall has unique laws. So there's a later case which says we make the residents of a courtyard chip in for a gatehouse, but again, that's unique as a visual trespass from the public domain is treated more strictly. It argues yet another case which implies that if there's enough room for both sides to get at least 4 cubits, they can force a division to be made, again implying that visual trespass is considered to be a damage, and this is needed to prevent this. So again, it's answered, it's not referring to a wall, that's specifically talking about a boundary marker. Okay, another later case, it says when building a wall directly opposite somebody's house, the window placement has to be arranged so that way he can't just look into the person's house. So it's explained that visual trespass straight into somebody's house is treated more stringently than into somebody's yard, so again, it's not comparable. One last proof, if somebody's roof is next to his neighbor's courtyard, he needs to put a fence up there so he can't just look into the man's yard. The implication is that visual trespass is an issue. So here the answer is it's a unique case, as the yard owner can claim that the man's roof usage is irregular and he doesn't know when he'll be up there. Other versions of this debate are cited regarding the translation of the word mechitza and if the implication is that visual trespass is considered to be a damage. For instance, if visual trespass was actually considered to be a damage, then regarding the case where the partners agreed to divide their courtyard, seemingly even if they hadn't agreed, they would be obligated to build a wall. So it answers that this courtyard in question was too small to force a wall, and one's only built if they both consent to it. It discusses some variation on this. More particularly, the division is obligatory here, as either they acquired their own sides of the courtyard, making retraction impossible, or it's that they went into the property and acquired their half by making an improvement, hence why retraction is, again, impermissible. Definitions for the various different types of stones are provided. Some say that the implication is that if the wall was made of half bricks, there must be a handbreadth gap in between the 2 sides of the wall, although there's variation if This is if it's filled with pure or inferior mortar. It's also asked, there were several specified measurements for the width of the wall depending on the used material. Based on some related sources regarding the construction of the temple, it asks if this is the set width or if it varies depending on the height. The structure of the temple in regards to some particular laws is additionally discussed. It also learns from a source back in Tractate Eruvin that the listed measurements include the plastering layers. Somewhat unrelated, it mentions that a synagogue cannot be demolished unless there's a new synagogue built to replace it. Some say this is as they might negligently not rebuild one, others say it's out of concern that the community won't have a place to pray, so there's a practical difference if there is a different synagogue located nearby, as then the second issue wouldn't apply. It brings some instances of this principle. Some say a synagogue can just be demolished if it's actively falling apart, which is possibly the reason the temple was allowed to be taken down and renovated by the king Herod, or that was unique as a king is trusted to keep his pledge. Related on Herod, it said that Herod was originally a slave of the Hashmona'i house and wanted to marry a girl from the family, and heard a voice from heaven saying that any slave right now that rebels will succeed. So he killed all of the slave masters and the Hashmona'im family, but spared the girl to marry her. The girl, however, decided to prevent this by going to a roof announcing that the line of the Hashmona'im kings would end with her, and Herod would remain a slave, and then jumped off, taking her own life. Herod, however, decided to preserve her corpse in honey, possibly in order to marry her and ascend the throne by right, and others say it was just in order to cohabit with her. Anyways, then Herod killed all the sages, besides for one as an advisor, but decided to blind him. Herod once came to this blind sage, pretending to be a commoner, and questioned him at length about the king, but the sage remained loyal and refused to speak ill of Herod, so Herod regretted killing all the other sages and decided to rebuild the temple as recompense. Herod used delaying tactics to try and get permission from the Roman government and built it in the meanwhile, but they forbade it anyways. But the temple was built, and it spends some time describing its beauty, particularly with its stonework. It says it was permitted for the sage to help Herod in this case, either as he was still legally a slave, or as it was in order to rebuild the temple. It mentions some similar points by the prophet Daniel. Anyways, back to property law. It said it goes according to the local custom. This is to include that if the custom is to make a weak wall, like one out of palm fronds, then that's what should be done. It had also stated that if the wall collapsed, the land and stones are equally divided. This is necessary to state to show this applies even if the stones all fall onto one property, or it's to show that it applies even if one partner cleared all the stones into his property, taking them, that they still need to divide it. It also qualifies the remaining teachings, saying that an ordinary garden is considered a place where there's typically a partition, so the residents can be obligated to build one, unlike by a valley where there's no such custom. Now, if only one person is building the wall, it said that he should build a sign to indicate his sole ownership, specifically on the other end of his neighbor's side, extending the wall slightly. It can't be on his own side, as then the neighbor could just attach his own extension, and additionally there's no concern of the neighbor just cutting the extension off, as that would be noticeable. It brings other variations on this. Another method of making a sign on a wall marking ownership is to put a lime coating on the opposite side. Additionally, if the wall is made out of palm fronds, a sign could be made by arranging the tips to be woven together on the opposite side. Others say this could be undone, so a document just needs to be written up. Finally, if both sides consent to a wall, it says they should make signs on both sides. This would specifically be necessary if, during the building, one side makes a sign. So, to show that both own the wall, the other one also makes a sign. Alternatively, others say that it's a case with palm fronds, and it's refuting the opinion that a sign cannot be made with such a material. New Mishnah. If somebody has fields on 3 sides around his neighbor, and he puts fences all around, like so, the resident in the center is not obligated to help pay for these walls. However, some say if the resident in the center builds a 4th wall at the bottom, thereby making official use of all 3 walls, he becomes obligated to chip in for all of the walls. The Gemara says we do hold like this latter opinion. Additionally, some say he needs to chip in for the other fences, no matter what they cost, even if they were expensive. Others say he only needs to chip in for the cost value of a cheap reed fence. But then what exactly is the dispute in the Mishnah as to what the center field owner needs to pay for, besides for whether it's for all of the expensive walls or not? So it gives a few suggestions that they're actually debating if he should be paying the value of a watchman or of a cheap reed fence, or it's that they're debating if he needs to chip in for the 4th fence or for all 4 of the fences. Or the debate could be as to who's building this last fence, as to if it's the outer or inner neighbor that would create responsibility for him to pay for all the fences. There's 2 variations on this last one. It quotes a few instances of a case like this occurring and some similar ones. New Mishnah. If a courtyard wall collapsed, every neighbor needs to chip in to build it back up to 4 cubits tall. Everybody is later presumed to have chipped in, unless specific proof is brought otherwise. It doesn't need to be rebuilt higher than 4 cubits, but if one of the neighbors decides to do it anyways, and then a second neighbor builds a parallel wall opposite of the same height with intent to extend the roof over, he shows he's benefiting from the first wall, and even before the second guy builds the roof, he's obligated to help pay for the first full wall. Additionally, he isn't presumed to have helped pay for it unless he brings proof. The Gemara says there's a debate if the time for a man to pay a loan comes up, and he says he already paid it. Some say he's not believed, as we don't presume people pay their loans early, and others disagree and say he would be believed. So it debates both of these opinions from our Mishnah, where there's an apparent presumption to have paid for the wall in the first case, and a presumption of the inverse in the second case. So it said both are different. In the first case, as each row of stones is being set down, it's considered time to pay the loan. And then in the latter case, the builder of the parallel wall didn't realize that he would be liable to pay for the opposite wall, so it's also not comparable. It's also said that the law we hold like is that there's a presumption that a loan is not paid early, so if somebody claims that they had paid the loan early, they're not believed until they prove it. Based on this, it's asked if a lender demanded payment a bit after the due date, and the borrower claimed he repaid it before the due date came up, would he possibly actually be believed here, as he had the option to just say he had paid it after the due date, wherein he would have just been automatically believed, but for some reason he said he paid it before. So does this create a presumption that he's actually telling the truth? It argues a few different sources on this point, but they're all disproven and it remains unresolved. On the point that if the second neighbor builds a second wall parallel to the first, he's responsible to chip in for the first wall, as he presumably is making use of it. Some say if he only built half the wall parallel, he'd still need to chip in fully, but if it's attached to the corner, he only needs to pay for the extension that he's actually using. And others say by half a wall, he doesn't need to chip in, but would say that if he started installing settings for crossbeams, then he would be responsible to pay for the opposite wall. Related, it said that windows constructed into a wall don't create a presumption that the neighbor paid for part of a wall, and even if there are crossbeam settings installed, that still wouldn't create a presumption that the neighbor had chipped in, as the wall owner could say that he figured his neighbor might want to build an opposite wall and crossbeam, so he was preemptively building settings so that way his wall wouldn't be damaged if he decided to eventually do that. It's also said if somebody established the right with his neighbor to place thick crossbeams across his wall, then he's also allowed to put thin crossbeams, and if he had only established the right to place thin crossbeams, it's a debate if he can then also put across thick ones. Similarly, if somebody established the right to let water run off of his roof into his neighbor's entire courtyard, he can definitely also let it run off through a drain into one spot. And if somebody established the right to let water run off through a drain into one spot, it's a debate if he can then let it go across the entire roof. It's also a debate if a structure with a willow branch roof is unique in this case, as the water runoff is much more concentrated. Similarly, if somebody's renting an apartment in a large building, he has the right to use the inside of the beams and walls up to a distance of 4 cubits, including the roof, but just not the wall of the opening entrance. Others say he can, but he just can't use the plot of land behind the apartment, and others say he can even use that piece of land. Related, if a beam is built across a neighbor's wall to a hut for shade, if it stays there uncontested for over 30 days, this creates a presumption that the beam owner purchased the rights to put it there and he can leave it. If, however, the hut in question is a sukkah, the beam creates a presumption of permissibility after only 7 days, and if the beam was attached with cement, this creates an immediate presumption of permissibility. Back to points on visual trespass, it says if there are two houses on opposite ends of a public domain, they both need to make a 4-cubit high fence on at least half of their wall, on opposite sides, although overlapping slightly in the center. This would actually apply also with a private domain in the center. It just mentioned a public domain for a few listed reasons. Additionally, the specifics of this case show that if one man built half his fence before the other, and only then they went to court and obligated them to build a full division, the first man can't be forced to just finish his roof. The other man actually needs to build this misaligned parallel half on his own. Another case, if somebody owns a roof that overlooks his neighbor's courtyard, he needs to build a 4-cubit high fence. However, he would hold that between two adjacent roofs, there would only need to be a 10-handbreadth high fence so as to create a boundary marker that can't be crossed and to establish a clear line that if a thief crosses, he can be arrested. This is clarified. Additionally, if there are two adjacent courtyards, one higher than the other, a wall must be built, but regarding the part of the wall that goes from the bottom courtyard to reach the upper one, it's a debate if the upper courtyard person needs to pay for it. We bring a source which says he does need to. There's another case brought which results in the establishment that if a 2-story house starts sinking into the ground, the upstairs neighbor can prevent the downstairs neighbor from demolishing the house, as the lower story is still technically habitable so long as it extends above 10 handbreadths to the ground, and also so long as this was not stipulated prior. This is qualified and discusses some related incidents. The resulting rulings are that if a person built a wall behind somebody's window and offered to rebuild his other wall with new windows, the resident can still prevent the wall from being built, even if he only uses the house for storage. If two brothers inherited property, one receiving a house and one a garden, and one built a wall on the directly adjacent garden and blocking off the windows, he can leave the wall. This is qualified. Another brought case, some orphans had a promissory note and a receipt was brought claiming it was paid, but it was debated if it was actually a forgery, so it was ruled to just leave it and do nothing. And this last one, it does argue further if this is the ruling. New Mishnah. Some say a resident of a courtyard can be compelled to build a gatehouse and door. Others say it doesn't strictly need a gatehouse. Similarly, some say the residents of a city can be compelled to build a surrounding wall, double doors, and a crossbar. Others say it doesn't need a surrounding wall. To be a qualifying citizen for this that must pay these taxes, you must be a resident for 12 months or just have purchased a house. The Gemara explains a gatehouse is considered to be a good thing if it's not blocking off the poor, meaning if it's outside the door of the courtyard. Alternatively, it's that the gatehouse didn't have a door, thereby allowing the poor to enter, or alternatively, it's that it had a door but no lock, or alternatively, it's that it had a lock but it was on the outside. There's a debate if a courtyard far from a public road needs a gatehouse. Those that say it does is as sometimes there'll be traffic on the public road so people wouldn't go around and by the courtyard. Similarly, there's debate if there's a requirement to build a city wall even if it's far from the border, and the logic, why yes, is that it's possible invaders will go far past the border and eventually reach the city. Additionally, it's said that the tax for these structures is collected according to individual wealth, and possibly also proximity to the city's edge, but not by the number of household members. Some say this wall tax doesn't apply to the sages, as God protects them, and it brings a few verses as a source. It mentions some other unique exemptions from taxes and the related verses. There's a story, the sage Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi opened food storehouses for the poor after a famine, but said only learned individuals could enter and take food. One of this sage's students decided to disguise himself and pretended to be an ignoramus and begged for food. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi relented, and he started to feel bad having given food to an unlearned person, because he said that misfortune only comes to the world because of them, but he found out the person was actually a student and then decided to open his storehouses to everybody. Now, we said that after 12 months, a person is considered a citizen of a city and must pay certain taxes. This is particularly the citizens as opposed to the residents, which is a slightly different status as seen in some other cases. Additionally, this 12-month period is specifically before taxes are charged for boards for the city walls. Much earlier than that, after 30 days, the new citizen is expected to contribute to the soup kitchen. After 3 months, he's supposed to contribute to the community charity fund. After 6 months, he needs to start giving clothes to the poor. And after 9 months, he needs to start contributing towards burying the poor. Broadly, the city wall taxes and similar are charged from anybody that benefits from them, so this would include orphans but exclude the sages. It cites some related incidents on this. It mentions some points on the greatness of redeeming captives and discusses the previously mentioned community charities. The community charity box was run by 2 people, as one person can't be appointed an authority over the public, and the charity collectors are supposed to seize pledges, so long as the man is wealthy. It also brings some teachings on the greatness of charity collectors. Also, charity collectors are not supposed to do anything that could make it look like they're stealing, like they can't split up. If they find coins, they shouldn't pocket them, and similar. They're related points. This goes further. It said that the charity collectors should not be the ones dispersing the funds. Similarly, the temple treasurers shouldn't be expending the funds themselves. If a poor man asks for food, they should check his eligibility, but if a poor man asks for clothes, he's given it immediately, as people wouldn't pretend to be poor and wear lackluster clothing to get some free clothes. It's also based on a verse. Others say it's the exact inverse, that we'd freely give food as the poor man is hungry and shouldn't be made to wait, while by clothes he should be investigated. And they also bring a verse that apparently implies, like, their opinion. Related, if there's a poor man around and he isn't collecting door to door, he's given a bit more than a specific set amount of bread and flour, and he's given a bed and a pillow. If the poor man is around for Shabbos, then he's also given 3 meals. This is discussed. It's also said that a person should give at an absolute minimum a third of a shekel coin each year, based on a verse, although realistically the laws of Ma'aser apply, meaning you should always give 10% of your total income. Related, it said that one who causes somebody to do a charitable act is greater than the one who actually does it, as his task was more difficult. It quotes a few verses on the importance of giving charity. Further points on the great importance of charity are brought, and it discusses some various laws of ritual and purity. More on charity, it is said to be exceptionally great to do it in secret so as to not embarrass anybody, and there are lots of blessings given to those who give to the poor. It's also said that those that frequently give charity will be rewarded with wisdom, wealth, and knowledge based on some scriptural verses. In fact, one Roman official, Tyrannus Rufus, asked Rabbi Akiva why, if God loves the poor, doesn't he help them? And Rabbi Akiva answers that way others have an opportunity to help them by giving charity and be saved from Gehenna. The analogy given was of a king who punished his son, imprisoned him, and ordered nobody to feed him, so one man went and brought him some food, and the king was actually thankful. It was also said that the obligations of charity always apply, even in exile. Therefore, the point on the importance of giving charity, it said doing so protects the Jewish people, and that it brings Mashiach closer. Related, it said there are 10 strong things. A mountain, which is broken by iron, which is melted by fire, which is extinguished by water, which is carried by clouds, which are scattered by wind, which are carried by the body, which is broken by fear, which is dispelled by wine, which is lessened by sleep, and death is stronger than all of these, and charity itself is stronger than death. Therefore, the points on the importance of charity and its protective attributes. It said that charity given in secret protects the giver from an unnatural death. Therefore, the points on the importance of charity, and it said it's great if given altruistically or even unaltruistically from a Jewish person, as they still do it to fulfill God's will. But for others, it's said to be a wrong thing if it's given to receive a reward unaltruistically, as they'd regret the act if they don't receive a reward. There are additional points on this. It brings various other instances further expressing this great importance of giving charity. New Mishnah. A man cannot force his courtyard to be divided unless there are at least 4 cubits for him and his neighbor. A grain field is not divided unless there are 9 kav, which was an old measurement, for each neighbor. Others say 9.5 kav. A vegetable garden isn't divided unless there are half a kav per partner, and others say a quarter kav. A salon, a hall, a dovecot, a coat, a bathhouse, an olive press, and an irrigated field are all not divided unless there's a proper share for each neighbor. Broadly, anything that, if divided, would retain its name would be divided, and if not, it would not be divided. If both parties consent to divide the property, they can do so with even less than the listed minimum measurements. Scrolls of scripture cannot be divided even if both parties consent. The Gemara says the 4-cubit minimum for dividing a courtyard excludes the entrances, which it then sources. Related, if a courtyard has houses and it's being divided, sources seem to imply that for each entrance to a house, 4 cubits are granted, and the remainder is divided equally. If one partner had an entrance 8 cubits long, he receives those 8 cubits, 4 cubits wide. If there's a hole for date pits, the owner receives 4 cubits on each side of the hole, so long as one side wasn't specifically designated as an entrance. It's debated if the owner of a pavilion gets the 4 cubits in front when the courtyard is divided. Some say only specifically by a Roman pavilion, which had lower walls. Specifically, it said that a porch, a Roman pavilion, and a staircase to a gallery all give 4 cubits to their owner when the courtyard is divided. It said 4 cubits are not given to a chicken coop, as the chickens climb in and out on their own without help. A building with only half a roof is said to not receive 4 cubits, which is explained. Related principles are discussed regarding residents' rights regarding a mavoi alley. For instance, it said if there are alleys connecting to cities, the residents of one city can prevent the residents of the other city from closing these off, even if other routes exist. Also, if the alley from a city leads to a public thoroughfare, the people of the public thoroughfare can prevent the residents from blocking off the alley throughout the entire alley. Now, there was a debate as to the minimum amount of a grain field that can be divided. Some said 9 kav, others said 9.5 kav. It's explained this variance is based on the soil quality. In Babylonia, it was said each party needs to, at a minimum, receive an area that takes 1 day to plow, which it then defines. When dividing a water hole, each person should receive enough to draw water for each day. And then when dividing a vineyard, each person should receive 3 kav, which it said was not a point that was derived logically. Related, it said that since the destruction of the first temple, the power of prophecy was taken from prophets and given to sages. This is seen as sages would explain a ruling, and would later be found to also have been taught, like they said, as a tradition from Mount Sinai. Others said that since the destruction of the temple, prophecy was actually given to the insane and to children, and it cites some incidents of this. It also quotes some medical advice. When a firstborn inherits, he receives the firstborn portion of land and the typical inheritance, and both of these plots should be adjacent. It's a debate if the same would apply to a man who does yibum, the levirate marriage. A case is brought, a man purchased land next to his father's land, and when the inheritance was being divided, he requested this property as it was adjacent to his. It was ruled the other brothers could refuse this, and it brings some other instances of similar institutions. For instance, if there's a field bordered by a river and by a canal on each side, and it's being divided between 2 brothers, it should be divided into 8 segments from the corners, like this, so that way both get an equal amount of field next to the canal and the river. We said if 2 partners owned a mansion, they can only divide it if it's large enough for both of them to retain a proper share. It's a debate if one partner can compel the other to dissolve this partnership. It argues this from various cases. It gets into a related discussion as to whether various parts of scripture can be combined into a single scroll and the number of lines that must be left blank between certain books within the text. These and related principles are discussed along with the standard measurements of a Torah scroll. This relates to the structure of the Ark, wherein there's a debate as to how all the items stored within fit, being the sets of the tablets and the Torah scroll written by Moshe. So based on this, it tries to determine the dimensions of the scroll based on the dimensions of the Ark. This is additionally discussed, and related it mentions that Moshe was commended for destroying the tablets. It also gives the order of the books of prophets, of course being Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, and the 12 prophets, or in Hebrew, Yehoshua, Shoftim, Shmuel, Malachim, Yirmiyahu, Yecheskel, and Yeshaya. The order is additionally explained. Further, it said that Moshe wrote the Torah, being the 5 books of Moses, and also the passage of Bilam within, and also the book of Job. Yehoshua wrote the book of Joshua, and the last 8 verses of the Torah, which cover the passing of Moshe. Samuel wrote his own book, and the book of Judges, and the book of Ruth. King David wrote the book of Psalms, Tehillim, along with the 10 elders who composed parts of individual psalms, being Adam, Melchizedek, Abraham, Moshe, and others. Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, wrote his own book, the Book of Kings and of Lamentations. Chizkiah and his assistants wrote the books of Isaiah, Yeshaya, Proverbs, Song of Songs, Shirashirim, and Ecclesiastes, Koheles, which were actually written by King Solomon, King Shlomo, but he compiled them. And the remainder of the books were written by the men of the Great Assembly, although Ezra wrote his own book and the genealogy from Chronicles up until himself, and the remainder was finished by Nehemiah, son of Chachaliah. Some say that the last 8 verses of the Torah were nevertheless actually written by Moshe, which creates some variance as to how they are read. The source for these points on authorship are all individually qualified and discussed. There's debate as to when exactly Job, Eov, lived. Some said during the time that Moshe sent the spies into Israel. Others said Job wasn't ever real, he's just entirely a parable. Others said he was there during the Babylonian exile. This actually expands into a broader debate as to whether Job was even Jewish. It additionally expounds on the verses from the book of Job, giving some additional explanations of the story. This incident is spoken of further. It additionally expounds on Job's great righteousness and also on a few of his improper statements. These are additionally discussed. It also speaks on Abraham for a bit. It says in the verse that he was blessed bakol, which means with everything. There are a few interpretations as to what this means. Some say it means he was given a daughter. Some say it means he was given a daughter who he named Bakol. Others say that it means that all the kings came to him for advice due to his great knowledge in astrology. Others say it means that Abraham was given a precious stone that could cure anybody who looked at it, and when Abraham passed, it was then placed in the sun. Others say that it means that his grandson, Esau, waited until after he had passed to rebel, which it expands on. And others say that his son, Ishmael, repented during his lifetime, which it sources. There are further points on this. It said that there are 3 people that the evil inclination has no power over, being Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that there were 6 men that the angel of death had no dominion over, and that their souls were taken by God, being Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. The relevant verses are all cited. It's also said that they, along with Jacob's son Binyamin, that their bodies do not decay. Additionally, 4 men would never have died but for the sin of the tree of knowledge, establishing death. Binyamin, Amram, Moshe's father, Yishai, David's father, and Kilov, David's son. And all of these are tradition besides for Yishai, who the verse implies like. And that's the end of chapter 1.